We're about to watch $84 trillion move from baby boomers to their millennial children. Estimates vary, and we'll unpack why that matters. That's more than the GDP of most countries combined. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The Vanderbilt family lost the world's largest fortune in just 70 years through lavish spending and poor investments. So what does this mean for millennials stepping into sudden wealth? And how can they avoid the estate mistakes, tax traps, and 3 critical preservation rules that determine whether inherited money lasts or vanishes? But first, let's understand exactly how much money we're actually talking about. The biggest money movement in human history. Estimates vary on the exact figure. An oft-quoted number is $84 trillion, but later restatements put the total closer to $100 to $124 trillion once you adjust for inflation and recent asset gains. We'll use $84 trillion as a conservative benchmark for the U.S. transfer while noting the larger updated estimates. It's bigger than many national economies combined. This isn't just stacks of cash. It's homes, stocks, bonds, retirement accounts, art collections, farmland, and companies both small and enormous wrapped into that staggering figure. So what does it look like when the money actually begins to move? At peak, analysts project multiple trillions per year flowing across generations. Crude estimates put the annualized transfer in the multi-trillion range, underscoring the scale without pretending exact unanimity among experts. That's enough to fund every public school, every hospital system, and still have change left over. This isn't abstract. These are checks being written, properties changing titles, portfolios shifting names. And yet, calling it just an inheritance doesn't capture everything that's happening. When economists describe it, they include lifetime transfers like gifts, as well as the businesses that parents hand down to children. A modest diner in Ohio counts in this figure, right alongside multinational corporations. Then there's real estate, the single biggest component of generational wealth in most families. A home that a parent bought 40 years ago for $80,000 might now be valued closer to $1 million depending on the city. That increase doesn't just make housing less affordable for outsiders. It inflates the eventual inheritance for those who grew up in it. But here's where the story turns. Data shows the biggest chunk flows to a narrow slice. Roughly half the transfer goes to the very top of the recipient list, so the headline trillions are highly concentrated. That means while the number makes it sound like every millennial will wake up in 2025 with a golden ticket under their pillow, the wealth is concentrated enough that this lottery pays out spectacularly for some, and not at all for others. Take surveys of millennials who expect inheritance. A surprising percentage believe their parents or grandparents will leave them sums large enough to change their lives. The reality is sobering. Many do receive something, but often not in the hundreds of thousands they've been mentally penciling into their future plans. For most families, inheritances cover funeral costs, pay off lingering debts, maybe leave a cushion for emergencies. For others, particularly those who grew up in high-cost real estate markets, the transfer is more substantial, sometimes life-changing. But this is the exception, not the rule. The contradiction is striking. On a spreadsheet, millennials are positioned to become the wealthiest generation in history, inching past baby boomers as the heirs apparent. But spreadsheets hide distribution. The vast majority of the seats at the table are small chairs, while a handful resemble royal thrones. The average millennial inheritor, dividing across all who do receive, might take home around $400,000. That's enough to wipe out student debts, buy a house in a mid-range market, or reinvest for lasting growth. But averages smooth out uncomfortable truths. Nearly half of Americans will receive little to nothing at all, so while one sibling might be checking Zillow, another is learning they'll never see more than a few thousand. This mismatch between expectation and reality shapes behavior before the money even arrives. A surprising number of households make assumptions about future inheritances when planning careers, buying homes, or saving for retirement. If someone believes a windfall is waiting in their late 30s or 40s, they might justify living beyond their current means, thinking that someday safety net will catch them. But for half the country, that net doesn't appear, or arrives as a thread instead of a rope, pushing those expectations off a cliff. And even for those who do receive substantial inheritances, the arrival often creates just as many problems as it solves. One reason the windfalls are concentrated. Asset growth over the last 5 decades has tilted toward those who already owned. Property booms lifted homeowners to new heights. Stock market surges multiplied wealth for families that already had investments. Meanwhile, wages for most workers in service or entry-level jobs stagnated, leaving them with little more to pass down than sentimental items, not financial ones. Millennials therefore inherit not only a sum of wealth, but also the inequality built into the system that created it. If you track the numbers forward, economists project that baby boomers alone will eventually pass along about 70% of this transfer, because they are both the largest generational group and the richest in history. Gen X contributes the next chunk, but because they are smaller and in their peak earning years now, far less of their total net worth is set to move by 2025. This means millennials aren't just catching up by chance. The timing of their parents' retirements and life expectancies align almost perfectly with the start of their prime adult years. It is unusual in history for so much accumulated wealth to be set into motion in a single generation's window. For all the drama of trillion-dollar transfers, remember that this wealth doesn't show up as duffel bags of cash delivered to front doors. More often, it arrives through probate courts, legal documents, and asset managers who distribute stocks, bonds, and property gradually. A landlord inherits an apartment complex and suddenly becomes both owner and operator. A sibling inherits farmland in Kansas and has to decide between leasing it, selling it, or learning how to grow corn. A designer inherits shares of a company their parent owned stock in, and they must now choose to hold or sell. Money rarely arrives in its simplest spendable form. It shows up with obligations, legal costs, and sometimes long waiting periods. Still, for those who are on the receiving end of the larger checks, 2025 could mean life changes that were unimaginable a decade ago. For years, millennials were caricatured as the generation priced out of starter homes, mocked for affording only small luxuries like avocado toast or lattes. The coming wave means that, at least for a portion of them, both the latte and the house down payment can coexist in the same budget. Yes, you may soon afford the avocado toast and the mortgage, even if the mortgage costs more than an entire Victorian home did in your grandparents' day. And this is where the story gets interesting. Because the wealth is shifting, but not evenly, millennials as a group might soon be labeled the richest generation ever. But individually, most of them will still need to make hard financial choices. That divide between generation-level statistics and household-level reality is what makes this wealth transfer both historic and misleading at the same time. But even for those who do receive substantial amounts, history suggests that massive inheritances don't guarantee lasting wealth. Why old money keeps disappearing. The pattern repeats across centuries with unsettling consistency. The Vanderbilt fortune, once the largest private wealth in the world, vanished completely within 70 years through lavish spending and poor investments. British aristocrats who controlled entire counties lost their ancestral estates when they failed to adapt to changing economics. A widely cited rule of thumb, often repeated, though debated, suggests that about 70% of wealthy families lose their fortunes by the second generation and up to 90% by the third generation. This statistic comes from the Williams Group and has critics, but the underlying pattern appears across cultures and eras. The causes fall into three research-backed categories that destroy family wealth with remarkable efficiency. First, lifestyle inflation and unmanaged spending drain capital faster than most heirs realize, as successive generations assume expensive lifestyles are sustainable without the income streams that originally funded them. Second, lack of diversification and failure to maintain hard asset buffers leave inheritances vulnerable when single investments or industries decline. Third, family governance failures create squabbles and legal costs that can consume years of attorney fees while forcing asset sales at discount prices to settle disputes between siblings. These aren't mysterious forces, they're predictable management failures. Estate after estate in 19th century Britain collapsed when aristocratic families refused to diversify beyond agriculture as farming modernized. The Vanderbilt descendants held family reunions in rented spaces by the mid-20th century because no unified strategy existed between heirs. Modern celebrity inheritances follow similar patterns, with trust fund recipients making headlines for extravagant purchases rather than building lasting wealth. Research across wealthy households confirms what the anecdotes suggest. Roughly 7 in 10 wealthy families lose their wealth by the second generation, and 9 in 10 have little left by the third. These aren't isolated failures. They reflect structures almost designed to collapse without deliberate rebuilding at each stage. A fortune built through decades of entrepreneurship can start deteriorating with just a handful of careless years. The solution lies in treating inherited wealth like the enterprise it needs to become. Family offices, private firms that manage ultra-wealthy households, employ strategists who oversee investments, legal structures, and education for younger generations. By creating institutional frameworks around wealth, they dramatically increase survival rates. Families without such structures often rely on individual judgment, which proves erratic depending on who inherits. 2 estate preservation steps can make the difference between legacy and loss. First, set up multi-generational governance through family offices or, at minimum, structured trusts with professional oversight before money arrives. Second, ensure financial education for all potential heirs, since wealth management skills don't transfer automatically with assets. Many wealthy families lack even basic wills, making immediate action critical. The Vanderbilt curse wasn't mysterious, it was risk management ignored. Fortunes vanish not because money has expiration dates, but because the systems protecting them fail. Without budgets, investment strategies, and long-term planning, inherited wealth becomes unmanaged capital drifting toward predictable collapse. For millennials expecting substantial inheritances, these patterns carry practical urgency. The opportunity to pay off debts or buy property is obvious, but the sharper choice involves long-term management of whatever arrives. Turning inheritance into lasting foundation requires deliberate structure, professional advice, and honest recognition that wealth needs constant replenishment to survive. Without awareness and planning, substantial inheritances will appear and quietly vanish, leaving future generations wondering where the fortune went. Wealth is lost not because time erases it, but because families let it drift without discipline. The difference between becoming a cautionary tale and building lasting prosperity often comes down to whether heirs treat their inheritance as a windfall or as a business requiring management. Yet even as these inheritance patterns play out, the biggest question remains unanswered. If so many great fortunes disappear within generations, where does the real wealth actually come from? Who actually gets rich, the inheritors versus the builders? The answer lies in examining who actually controls the largest fortunes today. When people picture the richest individuals alive, it is easy to assume most of them were simply born into it. The truth is more nuanced. At the very top, many recent additions are self-made entrepreneurs. But inheritance still produces concentrated fortunes, and a meaningful portion of billionaire wealth comes from family dynasties. Today, billionaires can roughly be divided into 2 categories: those who inherited fortunes managed by older generations, and those who built new wealth themselves. If you line up the actual billionaires at the very top of the list, a pattern emerges. Many are still individuals who built businesses rather than people who inherited companies already made for them. But storied family names maintain significant positions through generational wealth. This matters because it reveals how wealth behaves differently at extreme levels. Inheritances may create wealthy individuals, even billionaires, but those fortunes tend to cluster among family groups already entrenched as global dynasties. The Waltons, heirs to Walmart, are one example. Multiple family members each appear near the top of global wealth rankings. The same applies to families tied to luxury conglomerates like Hermes and L'Oreal. Their names keep circulating not because they built something new, but because they inherited positions controlling companies that had already dominated markets for decades. Looking at 2025 billionaire data, the entrepreneurial pattern becomes clearer. Every year, new billionaires are added to the global list. Some joined through inheritances of sprawling estates, corporate shares, or old industrial fortunes. Yet many became billionaires through companies they built from the ground up. Industry breakdowns show finance and technology produce the most billionaires, underscoring that building still creates extreme wealth. In the past 2 decades, a large portion of new entrants reached billionaire status through tech platforms, renewable energy firms, biotechnology, and financial services. These industries move at a pace and scale that rewards original building more than passive inheriting. The divide creates tension in how we understand wealth. Inheritance has the unique ability to create sudden billionaires without any effort from their side. Someone can wake up after a significant transfer and find their name added to rich lists purely because of family ties. Self-made billionaires, on the other hand, represent the continued influence of entrepreneurship. They endure unpredictable risks, competition, and cycles of innovation, but they also have greater influence on where global markets move next. Their fortunes often reflect industries reshaping daily life. There is also an important difference in how long each type of fortune tends to last. Inherited billionaire wealth often becomes divided between siblings, cousins, or extended family over time. What begins as one massive empire can fracture within a few decades. By contrast, self-made billionaires often retain singular control over their company's stake, consolidating enormous influence in one person. That control makes them responsible for both the creation and preservation of their wealth. This distinction becomes critical for millennials looking at the future. As a generation, they may hold trillions more in aggregate wealth than their parents. Some will inherit substantial positions in family companies, real estate, or stock portfolios. A few will move directly into the billionaire class from inherited stakes alone. Yet many of the millennial billionaires we see emerging are shaping their own paths as builders, not as heirs. Growing industries like artificial intelligence, climate technology, and blockchain platforms are producing fortunes faster than inheritance can distribute them. This reality provides an important corrective to the narrative that inheritance alone explains the billionaire landscape. While significant dynasties exist, fresh entrepreneurs continue to take many slots at the top level. In 2025 reports, the ratio still favors builders over pure inheritors. That tells us something about the way wealth functions today. Access to global capital, technology markets, and new business models disproportionately rewards individuals who create companies that scale worldwide. Another way to see this difference is by examining patterns of new wealth creation by year. In any given year, dozens of individuals rise into billionaire status. The total number of new billionaires added through inheritance fluctuates with the timing of transfers, families selling stakes after a death, or legal structures dissolving. But the steadier, larger stream comes from entrepreneurs who pushed companies forward in the global market. This trend has held across industries that define recent decades, from social media to e-commerce to pharmaceuticals. For millennials eager to understand where they stand, the distinction is clear. Inheritance creates security. Entrepreneurship creates new leaders and often drives the next generation of top fortunes. Generational wealth transfer provides opportunities for comfort, for new houses, and in some cases for business ownership. It may even ensure that certain family names remain connected to global wealth indices for decades more. But the record shows that if the goal is not just affluence but entry into the highest tiers of global wealth, building matters more than inheriting. If your goal is to build extreme wealth rather than preserve inherited capital, entrepreneurship and active investment strategy are the primary routes. Those who inherit risk becoming stewards of fortunes they did not create, with the responsibility to manage without expansion. Those who build place themselves at the center of emerging industries and gain the chance to control how their wealth grows. The $84 trillion transfer will raise aggregate wealth levels for the generation, but the road to billionaire status runs through building, not simply receiving. Yet for most millennials, the inheritance question isn't about joining billionaire ranks. It's about more practical windfalls that arrive in forms they might not expect. The housing jackpot, when mom's house becomes a mansion. The most common windfall arrives not as stock certificates or cash, but as house keys. A small brick house purchased for a few $1,000s in the 1970s can today be valued in the millions if it happens to sit in the right zip code. That simple fact explains why the real estate market plays such an outsized role in the $84 trillion wealth transfer. Boomers own a disproportionate share of housing. For example, in the US they control roughly 37% of the housing stock, which is why real estate is such a big part of transfers. Cities like San Francisco make this story obvious. In the mid-20th century, middle-income workers could buy homes there at prices that were reasonable for salaries of teachers, shopkeepers, or small business owners. The same houses are now valued at several $million, even before renovations or improvements are factored in. These inflated values mean that the children inheriting them become instant paper millionaires, even if that paper wealth doesn't translate into spendable cash. The rise in housing values adds a twist to generational wealth that differs from traditional inheritances. Cash and investment portfolios are relatively straightforward to divide and spend. Real estate is not. A house cannot easily be split among siblings, so property often forces difficult decisions. Should it be sold so the value can be divided? Should one child keep it and buy out the others? Property also comes with upkeep. Roofs need replacing, plumbing systems age, heating and cooling systems wear out. These aren't glamorous problems, but they arrive alongside the asset. Houses are liquid assets that come with ongoing taxes and maintenance costs that many heirs underestimate. Probate disputes are rising in places like the UK as families struggle over property decisions, and legal fights can drag on for years. Before assuming an inherited property equals spendable cash, heirs need to calculate taxes, maintenance costs, and liquidity needs. What looks like a pristine benefit from the outside often arrives with complications inside the financial paperwork. Because real estate is so significant in the $84 trillion figure, it is important to see how much of this wealth is locked up rather than ready to spend. An art collection or equities portfolio can be sold quickly if immediate funds are needed. A 3-bedroom house in Brooklyn cannot. Market conditions can also slow sales or drop values at inconvenient times. Thus, wealth on real estate balance sheets may inflate inheritance totals nationally, but at the individual level it creates both opportunity and challenge. The impact is unequal depending on geography. Families in cities with runaway price growth hold inheritances that may surprise even them. Those in stagnant or rural markets do not see the same bump. A family home in Detroit, for example, may not generate nearly the same return as one in San Jose, even if both represent decades of pride and stability for their owners. This unevenness reinforces the already sharp differences in intergenerational transfers. Consider again how one average house could account for multiple lifetimes of salary. A home purchased for $50,000 in 1972 may now be appraised at $1.5 million. That increase alone represents 30 times its initial value and creates a fortune even for families who never viewed themselves as wealthy. Inheritance in those cases is the direct result of inflation and real estate booms, not strategic savings or investments. Yet the housing jackpot is complicated by debts attached to property. Mortgages not fully paid off must still be settled. Home equity loans that parents use to fund retirement or pay medical bills can reduce the net value of the asset passed on. These obligations transfer with the property if heirs want to keep it, or must be cleared during sales. If you inherit a house, decide early, rent, sell, or hold, and calculate taxes, maintenance, and liquidity needs first. Each choice comes with its own risks and expenses. None of it functions like cashing a lottery ticket, even if the numbers on paper appear dazzling. Millennials inheriting houses will often find themselves becoming accidental landlords or reluctant participants in real estate sales, not simply instant beneficiaries of sudden fortune. The maintenance obligations alone change the story. Heating systems, plumbing, roofs, foundations, all these demand money long before they generate any. Local laws sometimes require upgrades for energy efficiency or safety before a sale is approved, further eating into an expected windfall. These costs mean the so-called housing jackpot hands over a long to-do list alongside the title deed. Parents may gift down payments or funds now to avoid a complicated, taxed, a liquid transfer later. This giving while living trend allows families to bypass some of the complications that come with inherited real estate while providing immediate help when children need it most for their own home purchases. What follows is a reality check that every inheritor must face. When receiving the keys to a house, the gift also includes property taxes that recur yearly, repair bills that arrive without warning, and insurance that steadily rises with property value. Inheritances may look like million-dollar gains, but those same gains are offset by expenses most people never consider until they are living them. The story of inherited housing therefore reveals the limits of the wealthiest generation label. On paper, the numbers point to newfound affluence. In practice, houses passed down to heirs will often require immediate financial discipline and long-term planning. For millennials prepared to manage that responsibility, the transfer represents both financial security and opportunity. For those less prepared, it may feel more like inheriting an endless repair bill than claiming a golden prize. But even for those who navigate the complexities of inherited real estate successfully, another challenge awaits that. Many families never anticipate until it arrives with the paperwork. The taxman cometh. Estate taxes and administrative costs create the first major hurdle. When most people imagine receiving an inheritance, they picture a figure handed over cleanly, like a number already waiting in their bank account. But the reality involves multiple deductions that reduce net inheritance. Federal estate tax on very large estates, state estate or inheritance taxes where applicable, probate and estate administration fees, and debts and unpaid bills that must be settled first. In some large estates, combined federal and state estate taxes and probate costs can approach 30 to 40%, but most estates fall below federal exemption thresholds, so the actual tax bite varies widely. In the United States, federal estate tax applies only above high exemptions. Many estates pay nothing at the federal level. Recent laws set that exemption so high that only the wealthiest families face the steepest rates. That means the average family home or moderate savings account isn't subject to direct federal estate tax. Yet some states add their own estate or inheritance taxes on top of federal policies. In places where housing prices skyrocketed over decades, families may discover they slide into taxable categories purely due to property appreciation. The distinction between estate and inheritance taxes matters for planning. Estate taxes are paid by the estate before distribution, while inheritance taxes are paid by recipients after they receive assets. Cross-country rules differ significantly. Canada has no inheritance tax, but has deemed disposition rules that trigger capital gains at death, while other countries impose substantial rates above exemption thresholds. For families with assets or heirs in different countries, consult cross-border estate tax professionals to avoid potential double taxation traps. The bigger issue comes from the combination of taxes with administrative costs. Even when families fall beneath major exemption levels, estates are processed through court systems that require legal representation, accounting, and filing fees. These costs alone may consume a meaningful portion of the inheritance. Add in debts, mortgages still owed, credit lines used for later life expenses, medical bills, and the total whittled away before distribution can be substantial. Families expecting a straightforward handover often encounter months, or even years of probate before anything tangible reaches heirs. For example, a family with a home worth $1 million might discover that paying off remaining loans, covering probate attorneys, and addressing tax obligations reduces the final check to closer to $500,000. That is still life-changing money, but it is strikingly different from what heirs first assume when they hear the property's valuation. At the larger scale of multi-generational fortunes, the difference between gross value and net inheritance can span millions. Estate planning tools exist precisely to limit these losses. Trusts are one of the most common. By placing assets into a trust during life, parents can both set conditions for distribution and protect assets from certain taxes or creditors. Trusts vary in form: revocable, irrevocable, charitable, but each type allows greater control of how and when heirs receive funds. Another common strategy is gifting assets gradually while still alive. Tax codes in many countries allow annual gift exclusions up to a specific amount, which over decades lets parents transfer wealth in smaller increments without triggering larger estate taxes. Family-owned businesses present unique challenges, often requiring even more careful planning. Passing on company stock may create liquidity issues if heirs owe taxes based on valuation, but do not want to sell shares of the company. Families sometimes plan ahead by creating buy-sell agreements or designating insurance policies designed to cover potential liabilities. Without such planning, heirs can be forced to liquidate businesses simply to satisfy tax bills, undoing decades of growth. Then there are the less visible administrative drags. Executors, professional advisors, appraisers, all must be paid from the estate itself. Even honest professionals charge significant fees given the legal work required. The longer estates remain in court, the higher those fees climb. For complicated estates with disputes between siblings or cousins, legal battles can last years. Each year eats into the balance that eventually reaches heirs. To prevent such outcomes, estate conversations between generations are essential. Many parents avoid discussing finances with their children, hoping to spare discomfort. Yet silence breeds confusion, and confusion breeds cost. If heirs are unprepared for tax consequences, they may liquidate hastily, sell undervalued assets, or fail to take advantage of exemptions. Communication about intent, even if not precise dollar amounts, reduces the likelihood of sudden missteps. Consider the math at extremes. A $10 million estate located in a state that imposes its own taxes could face combined rates approaching 40% without careful planning. That converts to $4 million lost before heirs receive their share, not including debts or legal charges. Even average estates can lose significant percentages if handled without attention. These are not rare cases. They are common enough that professionals working in the field routinely warn families not to conflate gross estate value with inheritance value. For heirs expecting inheritances large enough to transform their finances, this reality demands preparation. Without institutional planning, trusts, gifts, insurance structures, the transfer process alone can feel like a second tax season stretched over years. Families that approach the estate as a business transition, not a lottery payout, tend to preserve much more. The surprising conclusion is that inheritance does not simply pour wealth into younger generations. It tests the structures built to defend that wealth from erosion. Without careful preparation, an inheritance becomes a number negotiated down by taxes, debts, court systems, and professionals who charge fees. With preparation, it has a chance to arrive almost intact. Yet even families who navigate these challenges successfully discover that the rules governing inheritance vary dramatically depending on something most people never consider when planning their financial future. Geography of inheritance, where you're born matters. Geography shapes inheritance in ways that are easy to overlook. The role it plays in wealth transfer depends not only on family circumstances, but also on the economy and legal system of the country where someone lives. Inheritance statistics are often presented as though they apply everywhere the same way, but international evidence shows that where you are born determines how important family transfers become in your lifetime. Research shows inheritance flows as a share of national income rose sharply in stagnant economies. Italy is a prime example, where inheritance comprises a far larger share of wealth than in high-growth countries. In the United States, inheritances are immense in absolute terms, but make up a smaller slice of the economy compared to entrepreneurial wealth creation. That contrast illustrates how national growth rates, demographics, and laws all alter the role of inheritance. One straightforward driver is economic performance. Slower wage growth and larger asset appreciation, especially in housing, mean wealth accumulates in older generations and then arrives in big relative terms when passed down. In faster-growing economies, newly generated wealth through wages, innovation, and entrepreneurship dilutes the proportional importance of inheritance. This helps explain why Italy, with decades of sluggish productivity and job markets that offer limited upward mobility, records higher inheritance shares. For many Italian millennials, family property transfers are central to financial stability. By comparison, in the US, a technology startup, a financial career, or equity investments remain just as likely to create wealth as parental estates. The Italian case highlights another layer: demographics. A large aging population paired with years of limited wage growth meant that families held onto property wealth while younger generations struggled to save. Homes that once seemed modest became prized assets simply because they sat in cities where prices rose faster than incomes. In such an environment, inheritance turns into a dominant channel of wealth transfer. These numbers look outsized against sluggish GDP growth, but the reliance makes sense when compared to how little new income is being created for younger workers. Contrast that to the United States, where most of the new billionaires reach the top through building, not inheriting. Entrepreneurial gains, new technologies, and financial markets generate enormous wealth flows independent of inheritance. In this setting, even though the US will see trillions of dollars passed down, inheritance plays a smaller structural role relative to GDP than in Italy or Japan. Patterns vary clearly by country. Some economies lean heavily on intergenerational transfers, while others remain more shaped by entrepreneurial wealth. Inheritance law also explains part of the disparity. In much of continental Europe, forced heirship rules require that children receive a fixed share of estates, regardless of personal circumstances or family tensions. These legal frameworks guarantee wealth is passed down, but by doing so, they entrench inequality from one generation to the next. Families cannot divert assets outside of their heirs, which helps ensure inheritance remains a dominant part of wealth statistics. In faster-growing economies with looser rules, the dynamism of labor income and investment reduces inheritance's relative importance. The United Kingdom represents a middle case. Property values in London and the Southeast rose so sharply in recent decades that inheritance became significant for homeowners. Yet the UK also runs one of the world's foremost financial centers. That means inheritance there matters, but new fortunes still emerge through finance, technology, and creative industries. Across continental Europe, the balance tips more toward inheritance. France, Germany, and especially Italy continue to show high percentages of wealth tied to generational transfers. Asia adds further complexity. Japan mirrors Italy in some respects, with a highly aged population, decades of stagnation, and a resulting dependence on inheritance as one of the most significant wealth channels. Japanese inheritance taxes are among the world's strictest, reflecting exactly how central these transfers have become in sustaining financial structures. By contrast, China and India illustrate how rapid economic growth shifts the balance toward entrepreneurship. Explosive expansions in real estate development, consumer platforms, and manufacturing have generated massive first-generation fortunes, making inheritance proportionally less important even if the absolute figures are climbing. Looking backward, history reinforces this story. The mid-20th century saw inheritance relative to GDP collapse in many advanced economies due to wars, taxation, and restructuring. Since then, in slow-growth contexts like Italy or Japan, inheritance returned in force as one of the most visible wealth flows. Researchers point out that if the economy grows slowly, inherited assets look comparatively large against GDP, even when they are smaller in global terms. The reverse applies in high-growth countries. Huge inheritances exist, but they represent a modest proportion relative to new wealth creation. For millennials, this geography creates two very different financial realities. In a country like Italy, inheritance is central. Without family transfers, it is difficult to climb, since job growth and wages lag. Home ownership, entrepreneurship, and household savings often depend directly on inherited property. In the United States, inheritance still matters, but entrepreneurship and investment success can surpass it. An American millennial may be aware of the trillions changing hands, but might enlarge their fortune more reliably by focusing on business opportunities. Two individuals of the same age and skills encounter completely different financial futures depending on where they live. The composition of inheritances deepens this divide. In Southern Europe, homes dominate estates. The value lies in historic city real estate rather than in stock portfolios or corporate ownership. Properties create a unique form of immobile but visible wealth, substantial on paper, slower to convert into spendable funds. In the United States or in East Asia's fast-growing economies, inheritances more often include diversified investments. That allows greater liquidity, reinvestment, and participation in global growth sectors. The form of the asset therefore determines what heirs can realistically do with what they receive. Cultural behaviors follow from these realities. Societies that rely heavily on direct inheritance often see life milestones delayed until after a transfer occurs. Decisions about housing, family planning, or retirement savings remain tied to estate timing. In fast-growth countries, decisions are more closely linked to job strategies or entrepreneurial ventures. For families in Italy or Japan, estates define the future. In America or China, occupations, markets, and startups play a larger role. Governments respond accordingly. Italy and France rely on inheritance taxes as a visible way to redistribute or capture part of the wealth passing hands. The US, by contrast, sets federal exemption levels so high most estates never pay, which helps keep inheritance a smaller distortion in the overall economy. Japan's high inheritance taxation reflects its demographic pressure and the outsized role inheritance plays in personal wealth. These differences show how law adapts to each environment, and they explain why global comparisons must always be grounded in local contexts. The contrast between Italy and the United States illustrates this clearly. In Italy, more than half of the country's billionaires derive their wealth from inheritance, reinforcing a system where the most significant fortunes cycle within families. In America, many fortunes start with entrepreneurs creating entirely new industries, even as dynasties like the Waltons remain powerful. Patterns of inheritance are therefore not absolute opposites, but variations shaped by growth, demographics, laws, and property markets. For viewers, the implication is direct. If you live in a slow-growth, high-inheritance country, planning should emphasize estate communication, housing strategy, and preparing for a transfer that may dictate long-term financial security. If you live in a higher-growth economy where entrepreneurship drives opportunity, career advancement, and smart investment may be more significant paths. Understanding this context is essential before estimating what inheritance means for your future. What geography makes clear is that inheritance is not a universal outcome, but a conditional one, tied to forces far beyond an individual family. And while the scale and structure of an inheritance depend heavily on the country, how an heir actually responds when the money or property arrives is a different challenge altogether. It raises an even more personal question. What happens to someone's financial life once the windfall is in their hands? The psychology of sudden wealth. The psychology of sudden wealth is one of the most misunderstood aspects of inheritance. Receiving hundreds of thousands, or even millions, may appear to eliminate every financial worry. To someone still paying down student loans or struggling to buy a first home, a six-figure windfall feels like freedom. But research on sudden wealth events, from inheritances to lottery wins, shows that financial outcomes are often disappointing. Many recipients end up no better off within a few years, sometimes worse, because they were unprepared for the responsibilities that come with a sudden leap in wealth. Studies show only about 30% of Gen Z and Millennials rate their long-term financial health highly, and many lack basic financial literacy, a major readiness gap. That lack of preparation explains why, in many cases, sudden wealth becomes fragile. The money itself isn't enough. What matters is whether the recipient has the skills, habits, and discipline to manage it. A large check arriving in the mail doesn't upgrade financial judgment or erase poor money habits built up over years. The pattern is clear in studies of lottery winners. Overnight millions push people into a new income category, but their decision-making remains unchanged. Heirs face similar challenges. The numbers in their bank accounts shift, but their instincts about budgeting, investing, and risk do not. Without deliberate updates to behavior, the inheritance shrinks. When new obligations are taken on, whether in the form of mortgages, car payments, or loans to family, the brief period of abundance gives way to stress once the balance declines. Two behavioral traps drive the fastest declines. The first is lifestyle inflation. When spending rises to meet new wealth, small luxuries quickly evolve into permanent costs. A larger house comes with higher property taxes, insurance, and repairs. A luxury car increases monthly burn rate through premiums and maintenance. Vacations escalate from affordable to extravagant. What appeared to be a fortune evaporates as normal life, redefines itself at an unsustainable level. The second is poor investing and misplaced trust. Without guidance, heirs often plunge into speculative assets or accept risky business pitches from acquaintances. Instead of growing capital, they scatter it across ventures they don't understand. Both traps stem from the same root problem: lack of education and absence of a clear plan. The solution is simple but not easy. Prioritize early financial education and seek professional fiduciary advice before making large decisions. Social dynamics make these traps worse. Sudden wealth can attract pressure from friends or extended family who view the inheritance as communal. Requests for gifts, loans, or joint investments often come quickly, and saying no can be difficult. Some recipients spend heavily on visible luxuries simply to meet social expectations, even when they know it depletes their resources. Here again, advice matters. A clear budget and the discipline to stick to it, supported by outside professionals, provide cover to resist these pressures. Then comes the emotional side, which research shows is just as significant as dollars and cents. Expect emotional complexity, guilt and pressure are common, and plan conversations accordingly. Many heirs hesitate to make decisions out of guilt tied to loss, or they avoid financial planning entirely until bills and taxes have consumed much of the balance. Others rush to detach through overspending, treating money as a way to escape uncomfortable feelings. These invisible forces shape outcomes as much as market returns. Recognizing their presence and preparing for them can make the difference between a constructive transition and a wasted opportunity. Financial planners often describe sudden wealth in phases. The first year brings disorganization. Grief, paperwork, and legal processes combine with immediate spending needs. The second year often produces a sense of abundance, which leads to lifestyle upgrades. By the third or fourth year, the results of early decisions begin to show. In many cases, inheritances that could have supported decades of comfort dwindle to almost nothing within 5 years. But when new wealth is approached with structure and discipline, this early window can instead be the launch point for stability that compounds for decades. The problem is not confined to multi-million estates. A modest inheritance of $200,000 can completely restructure a family's finances if applied thoughtfully, eliminating debt, creating an emergency fund, and establishing an investment base. But without a plan, the same sum disappears in scattered purchases and ephemeral upgrades. At the higher end, inheritances of $2 million or more can set up security across generations, but only if recipients avoid treating the windfall as limitless. The common thread across amounts is clear. Unpreparedness creates fragility, while preparation builds permanence. So, how do heirs prepare? If you expect to inherit, start financial training now. Build a simple budget, speak with a fiduciary advisor, and consider a basic financial literacy course. Research consistently shows early professional guidance increases the odds of preserving wealth. These steps may sound mundane, but they are far more effective at protecting assets than extravagant purchases are at signaling success. Wealth psychology also reveals why this approach matters. People's sense of normal adjusts rapidly to the resources they command. When spending rises to the new level of income or capital, satisfaction soon levels back to baseline, even as costs lock in permanently. By contrast, keeping spending stable while investing the difference allows satisfaction to rise more gradually while preserving capital. Avoiding sudden shifts in what feels normal is therefore not just financially sound, but psychologically stabilizing too. Preparation also requires family conversations. Many parents avoid estate discussions, leaving heirs to discover obligations and taxes in the midst of grief. That lack of communication magnifies stress and increases costs. Early, honest conversations about structures, intentions, and responsibilities prepare recipients to treat inheritance as managed capital rather than casual spending money. This reframing alone can prevent the kinds of missteps that have erased great family fortunes in the past. The lesson is straightforward. Inheritances are not simply additions to balance sheets, they are psychological stress tests. Heirs who treat sudden wealth as an invitation to rewrite their financial lives overnight usually stumble. Those who slow down, build literacy, and align with professional guidance create lasting security. It is not the amount received that determines the outcome, but the preparation applied before it arrives. As trillions move between generations in the years ahead, millennials in particular face this test more than any group before them. The challenge is not whether money arrives, it is whether it lasts. And lasting wealth depends on something beyond a check or a property deed. The strategies heirs use to defend it from the same mistakes that have dismantled fortunes time and again. Which leads to the next question. If history shows even the largest fortunes can collapse within a generation or two, what specific steps can modern heirs take to avoid repeating those failures? How millennials can avoid the Vanderbilt trap? Millennials now face the test of managing what may be the largest wealth transfer in history. The cautionary tale is clear. Fortunes do not vanish because they are too small, but because they are poorly managed. The key lesson is that the decisions made in the first years after inheritance often determine whether capital compounds into stability or erodes into loss. Unlike past generations, millennials possess greater access to financial tools, education, and professional advice. Yet access only matters if paired with discipline and strategy. Diversification is the first and most basic defense. History shows that fortunes concentrated in single sectors, railroads, agriculture, even oil, withered when those industries lost dominance. Modern heirs confront similar risks if portfolios lean too heavily into one market. Balancing across asset classes, stocks, bonds, real estate, and businesses creates insulation. Research from Merrill and UBS emphasizes diversification as the foundation of wealth preservation, with measured allocations to core assets providing protection across economic cycles. The goal is not chasing every fad, but ensuring no collapse wipes out the whole. Spending discipline remains equally critical. The Vanderbilt heirs demonstrated how rapid lifestyle inflation can hollow out even enormous fortunes. Larger homes come with higher taxes and maintenance. Luxury cars add permanent burn rates. Repeated travel inflates ongoing costs. Inheritors who spend to match their sudden balance sheet often find that their principal steadily declines. By contrast, those who maintain stable lifestyles can stretch resources across generations. Restraint, not extravagance, extends the lifespan of capital. Communication across families is an overlooked safeguard. Research shows that nearly 60% of estates fail to transfer smoothly, not due to taxes or bad investments, but because of poor communication. Siblings clash over whether to sell or keep property. Heirs misunderstand parents' intentions. Court cases consume years of fees, further eroding assets. Open dialogue while parents are still alive. Setting guidelines on whether homes should be sold, whether assets should remain in family trusts, and how responsibilities will be handled, prevents destructive conflicts. Transparency costs discomfort now, but saves much larger sums later. Modern financial tools add a layer of complexity. Diversified index funds and ETFs remain reliable for broad exposure, with evidence supporting them as long-term core holdings. Millennials are also drawn to strategies unique to their era. ESG investing, aligning portfolios with environmental and social commitments, appeals to values yet still requires evaluation of returns. The underlying lesson holds: no thematic sector should become the sole anchor. Concentration in ESG funds, or any niche, still carries risk. Alternative investments and cryptocurrency deserve caution. Merrill and CNBC surveys find that millennials and Gen Z are more likely to allocate into alternatives like private equity, venture capital, or digital assets than older investors. These can deliver high returns but carry volatility and liquidity constraints. Research highlights that smart allocation limits such holdings to a measured slice of portfolios rather than treating them as core positions. The principle is proportionality. Newer assets may play a role, but only as part of a broader, balanced plan. Real estate fits a dual position. Many millennials will inherit property that has appreciated dramatically but is illiquid and expensive to maintain. Treating inherited property as one asset among many, whether to sell, rent, or hold, keeps it productive rather than burdensome. In many cases, rental income can provide stable returns if maintenance is well planned, while in others, selling and reallocating proceeds reduces family disputes or ongoing costs. The key is to fold property into an overarching wealth plan tailored to risk tolerance and liquidity needs. Professional structures can reinforce discipline. For significant estates, family offices or professional management teams create frameworks, control budgets, and enforce diversified allocation. Research indicates family offices play an outsized role in protecting ultra-high net worth households from dissolution. For families without such scale, adopting business-like systems still applies. Spreadsheets, budgets, investment tracking, and regular advisor meetings serve the same role at smaller levels. Wealth treated as casual inheritance tends to erode. Wealth treated as managed capital is preserved. To put these strategies in practical terms, 5 defensive moves stand out. First, setting up trusts and utilizing giving while living strategies helps minimize tax and probate losses, a point supported by estate planning research. Second, creating clear governance and communication plans prevents disputes that otherwise consume wealth. Third, employing professional advisors or family office structures ensures objective management, especially for larger estates. Fourth, diversifying across core asset classes, including measured exposure to hard assets and alternatives, reflects findings from UBS and Merrill on cross-cycle resilience. And fifth, investing in financial literacy for heirs strengthens long-term survival. Charles Schwab, Guardian Life, and Clear Estate findings show financial literacy gaps leave younger generations unprepared to sustain inheritance. Together, these steps create the structural defenses lacking in famous collapses like the Vanderbilts. Still, there is no one-size-fits-all plan. Each inheritance varies by geography, tax law, estate complexity, and family needs. The appropriate mix of trusts, equities, property, and alternative assets depends on time horizon, income requirements, and personal tolerance for risk. Even research-backed principles must be adapted to fit a household's context. The strongest long-term strategies acknowledge this variability, using professional guidance to tailor structures rather than forcing rigid formulas. The democratization of knowledge is a modern advantage, but it also removes excuses. Millennials can access financial education through apps, online courses, and advisory relationships at costs unthinkable in the past. Information that once belonged to exclusive circles is now broadly available. The challenge is not whether resources exist, but whether individuals choose to slow down, plan, and act deliberately. Many failures happen not because heirs lack guidance, but because they resist applying it. Long-term discipline grows stronger when paired with generational training. Setting up systems for children to practice real financial decisions, even at small scales, reduces the sudden shock effect millennials themselves often face. Intergenerational continuity in budgeting, investing, and oversight expands the window of wealth from 2 decades to multiple lifetimes. Families who teach skills alongside capital reduce the odds that money cycles from abundance to depletion within 1 or 2 generations. At its core, avoiding the Vanderbilt trap is less about chasing extraordinary gain than avoiding ordinary mistakes. Fortunes collapse through unchecked spending, overconcentration, and silence within families. Fortunes endure through structure, moderation, and open guidance. For millennials preparing for inheritance, the real objective must be survival. To receive capital, shield it from erosion, and extend its utility across decades. The final question is not simply how heirs protect wealth for themselves, but what broader effects emerge when millions of millennials inherit at once. Patterns of spending, investing, and asset allocation will ripple far beyond individual families, carrying consequences for entire economies. What begins as personal discipline shapes the flows of capital across markets, industries, and generations. Economic ripples ahead. What happens when trillions of dollars begin shifting into younger households is not just a question of families. It becomes a macroeconomic test. Economists describe this as the largest wealth transfer in recorded history, but the effects ripple across housing markets, corporate funding, and even charitable giving. Because millennials approach money differently from their parents, the assets they inherit may be deployed along new lines of priority. How those choices scale will determine whether entire sectors grow, stagnate, or transform. The clearest way to think about it is conditionally. Large injections of capital into younger demographics could provide stability by wiping out debts, fueling home purchases, and strengthening retirement saving. At the same time, sudden liquidity could fuel instability if the funds chase speculative assets or drive demand in markets with constrained supply. The balance between investment and consumption is the deciding factor, either a reinforcing cycle of growth or pockets of inflation and volatility. Early indications suggest the allocation patterns of younger investors look different. Surveys show millennials and Gen Z allocate more to ESG products and alternatives compared to boomers, and Bank of America Private Bank has found that younger investors regularly rank sustainability alongside returns in shaping decisions. CNBC reporting also highlighted that artificial intelligence has already minted new billionaires, a sign of how quickly wealth can emerge in specific sectors. If inherited capital flows follow this generational leaning, funds could tilt further toward ESG strategies, AI-driven opportunities, and private alternatives. That doesn't guarantee results, but direction matters. When trillions follow preferences, allocation itself reshapes which industries flourish. Housing represents the most immediate channel. Inheriting properties or down payment capital introduces new buyers into already constrained markets. If large numbers of inheritors decide to purchase at once, local prices could climb further, particularly in high-cost cities. That creates a paradox. Inheritances make housing attainable for some millennials, while pushing it further out of reach for their peers who inherit little. In markets already strained, the wealth transfer risks amplifying affordability gaps unless offset by policy responses or new construction. Capital flows into ESG and technology will likely form the second major channel. UBS and Merrill surveys both show sustainability, renewable energy, and climate technology ranking high on millennial investor lists. At the same time, AI has emerged as one of the fastest wealth-generating sectors of recent years. If significant portions of new inheritance capital rotate into these industries, firms tied to climate adaptation, digital platforms, and AI development may see disproportionate funding. That won't guarantee profits. Startups fail at high rates, but the surge of available risk capital could accelerate innovation by lowering barriers for new entrants. The third important channel is philanthropy. Many heirs will direct resources toward causes that match their values: education, climate response, and social equity. Unlike spending on property or businesses, these allocations influence nonprofit growth, academic research priorities, and local civic projects. When done at scale, philanthropy alters not only the charitable sector, but also policy indirectly, by funding advocacy and institutions aligned with generational concerns. The shape of influence will look different from the foundation structures built by industrial-era fortunes. Inflation risk, though often overstated, remains possible. The critical distinction is timing. If large majorities quickly spend inheritances on consumption and housing, local price pressure increases. If instead most wealth is reinvested in capital markets, the effect shows up less as consumer inflation and more as swelling asset prices. Economists note that this difference between spending and reinvesting shapes the entire macro outcome. In other words, whether the wealth transfer appears as inflation or as market growth depends entirely on the pattern inheritors choose. One anticipated outcome is that entrepreneurship may see an indirect boost. With financial cushions under them, more millennials may feel able to start businesses, experiment in technology, or leave corporate roles earlier than otherwise practical. Even if many enterprises fail, the overall increase in risk-taking can increase innovation and employment. Economists watch this closely, as entrepreneurship historically wells up in periods when capital barriers fall. Inheritances may function as the modern seed fund, distributed not through institutions but through personal transfers. Changes in financial behavior will matter as well. Millennials are more accustomed to app-based brokerages and digital ledgers, interacting with money through interfaces rather than through long-standing institutions. An influx of inherited funds into these channels could intensify trading volume and cycle volatility into newer asset classes, including cryptocurrencies, private credit, and venture funds. That contrasts with their parents, who routed more inherited wealth into bonds, retirement accounts, and conservative instruments. The platforms themselves, algorithm-driven and instant access, magnify both opportunity and instability. Policymakers already see the structural implications. Rising concentrations of inheritance risk widening inequality, even within generations. For those inheriting heavily, capital compounds and multiplies across markets. For those who inherit little, asset prices may accelerate beyond reach, restricting their opportunities while peers surge ahead. This divergence not only reflects in wealth statistics, but also influences labor mobility, political demands, and long-term prospects for social cohesion. Governments respond in different ways, from adjusting estate tax exemptions to considering housing reforms aimed at reducing affordability imbalances. Still, none of these outcomes are predetermined. Inheritance doesn't automatically create inflation, innovation, or inequality. It creates conditions under which each is more likely, depending on allocation decisions. If households use inheritances primarily for debt repayment and steady investment into diversified funds, the macro effects lean toward stability and long-term growth. If households chase speculative markets or concentrate into overheated housing, bubbles and imbalances will appear. Capital at scale is magnifying. It multiplies whatever behaviors dominate. For the broader economy, the key lesson is simple. Money changing hands alone does not define the outcome. What matters is how that capital is put to work, whether in property, innovation, philanthropy, or speculative churn. This transfer may eventually look as important as earlier instances when large cohorts reshaped markets, but its final legacy depends on behavior, not numbers. And while these ripples stretch across sectors, they do not reach everyone equally. Many will see life-changing sums that alter their financial options. Others will receive nothing at all, even as the headlines announce trillions moving. That gap between highly concentrated inheritances and the absence of them for the majority creates its own story, and it is one that defines the other side of this generational handover. What if you never inherit? So what if you never inherit at all? For most people, that is the reality. Research shows a majority of Americans will receive little. Studies indicate a large share of the transfer value goes to the top 1%, while many households receive only modest amounts. Some surveys suggest that roughly 60% of Americans inherit less than a few $1,000s across their entire lifetimes. That figure can feel startling given the headlines about trillions changing hands, but the truth is that wealth sits heavily concentrated within a small fraction of families. When parents or grandparents pass assets forward, some heirs receive more than they could ever spend, while most see sums too small to alter long-term financial security. This creates a common misconception. News about vast intergenerational transfers gives the impression that waiting alone is enough to change a financial future. In practice, distribution matters more than totals. Some millennials receive properties in expensive markets like San Francisco or Boston. Inheritances worth millions of dollars based purely on location. Many others inherit little beyond personal belongings, cars in need of repair, or even debts. In those cases, the wealth transfer is invisible. The gap produces more than financial inequality. It shapes expectations. A generation raised on headlines about trillions in motion often assumes an inheritance will arrive in midlife, enough to pay off loans, buy homes, or create investment portfolios. For most, such a windfall never comes. A check for a few $1,000s may ease a debt burden or cover funeral expenses, but it falls short of creating financial independence. Families without access to large transfers continue to build wealth the way people have always done, through education, work, savings, and enterprise. Housing markets highlight this divide. Significant inheritances allow certain heirs to break into expensive ownership markets where their peers remain shut out. Without those transfers, millions of working families continue renting well into middle age or beyond. This is not simply about wages. It reflects an inheritance gap that overlays the income gap, widening disparities across generations and neighborhoods. Some millennial households step into home equity overnight, while others stay locked into rising rents despite similar levels of effort and employment. But for the majority, the absence of inheritance does not equal the absence of opportunity. If you expect to inherit little, the path forward is the same one that built wealth for most people in the past. Consistent saving, investing early, and using education and entrepreneurship to expand earning power. These routes may not create the sudden drama of an inherited estate, but they remain reliable. History shows that families who built businesses, lived within their means, and reinvested steadily often became more financially secure than heirs who inherited more but managed it poorly. Entrepreneurship continues to be a durable path. Across cultures, many of today's wealthiest families built from scratch, starting with small enterprises that expanded over time. Not every venture becomes a billion-dollar corporation, but even modest side businesses can provide income streams that compound over decades. For younger households who will not receive substantial transfers, opportunities lie in building financial independence through projects they control rather than waiting for external family assets. Steady investing offers another route. Compounding remains the most accessible tool for those outside inheritance circles. Modest but regular monthly contributions to diversified funds accumulate into life-changing sums over 30 or 40 years. While few wake up feeling suddenly wealthy, the math of compounding creates outcomes that rival what most inheritances provide in practice. Research has repeatedly confirmed that even average salary earners can build significant portfolios by starting early and letting investments grow. Education and skill development add another layer. In economies reshaped by globalization and technology, wages increasingly flow to those with specialized, hard-to-replace skills. Higher earnings provide not just immediate security, but the surplus needed to save and invest. Building expertise turns human capital into financial capital. This was true long before the current debate about generational transfers, and it remains one of the most dependable strategies for upward mobility. The narrative of a great transfer risks creating fatalism among those expecting little. If wealth headlines suggest everyone else is receiving a fortune, individuals without such prospects may feel permanently behind. But focusing on what will not arrive obscures what remains possible. For most households throughout history, the wealth they passed on came not as windfalls, but as savings slowly accumulated across a lifetime. Inheritance makes inequality more visible, but it has never been the only path to prosperity. Comparisons intensify the problem. Seeing peers buy homes or invest early with inherited capital can make others feel hopeless. Yet outcomes differ more than appearances suggest. Many large inheritances erode quickly due to poor management or lifestyle inflation. By contrast, disciplined savers and investors often pass inherited peers over time. The comparison gap narrows when measured not by the first decade after inheritance, but across an entire working lifetime. Institutional tools also supplement this reality. Retirement accounts, employer matching, pension schemes, and tax-advantaged savings vehicles may appear less glamorous than estates, but they provide structured on-ramps to compounding wealth. Over 30 or 40 years, their cumulative impact can rival or exceed typical inheritances. For households excluded from family transfers, these options are essential. Research suggests that consistent contributions to retirement accounts often leave workers better prepared for old age than peers who relied on uncertain inheritances. Avoiding inheritance complications brings its own advantages. While those receiving estates face probate battles, property costs, and tax burdens, non-inheritors focus purely on the outcomes of their own choices. The financial system may be unequal, but for many, not relying on inheritance provides clarity. Your financial progress is the result of your decisions alone. That perspective can lead to stronger discipline and fewer distractions. Taken together, the evidence suggests a balanced view. Yes, trillions are moving between generations, and yes, some beneficiaries will become dramatically richer overnight. But most people will not. For that majority, wealth accumulation comes from predictable channels. Investing steadily, building skills, creating extra income streams, and protecting spending discipline. Those tools may not produce headlines, but they remain effective for turning modest beginnings into financial security. The practical takeaway is straightforward. Do not build plans around an inheritance that may never arrive. Structure your finances as if you will receive nothing, so any future inheritance becomes a bonus rather than a lifeline. Use retirement accounts aggressively. Treat education and skills as investments in your earning potential. Pursue side ventures or entrepreneurial projects if appropriate. Moderate spending and invest the difference. These approaches demand patience, but they deliver real results without dependence on family fortunes. The conversation about inheritance often overshadows a deeper truth. Money passing down shapes some lives, but financial independence is grounded in choices available to everyone. Inheriting little does not predetermine failure. It simply redirects the route towards savings, investments, and initiative. History shows that fortunes collapse when mishandled, but steadily built resources survive. For millennials and Gen Z who expect little inheritance, strength lies in assuming responsibility early, controlling what they can, and letting compounding do the rest. Viewed through this lens, the great transfer is not the ultimate determinant of your financial path. It is only the backdrop. What counts most is preparation, education, and consistent effort to build wealth directly. And that perspective naturally sets the stage for the broader question. When such a vast shift of capital moves across generations, will it support lasting prosperity, or will it repeat the familiar collapses seen so many times before? The $84 trillion transfer taking shape now highlights a simple reality. Trillions will change hands, but what matters most is the structures and choices that follow the transfer. Inheritance by itself does not secure a future. It requires deliberate management. For millennials preparing ahead, 3 steps stand out. Invest in financial literacy before the money arrives. Hold clear estate conversations with family to reduce conflict and surprises, and seek professional advice or use trusts to shield assets from unnecessary loss. These actions turn a windfall into lasting stability. Leave a comment with one question you want answered about inheritance, and subscribe if you want more practical, millennial-focused finance content.